and the title of my project is Extending Rawls, a philosophical approach to socialized inequality. Now, the goal for my project is to interpret and extend Rawls's theory of justice to address gender and racial inequality, particularly in the workplace. In doing so, I hope to show how Rawls's philosophical work can speak to the concerns of feminist and multicultural scholars, and how his work can inform our social justice efforts. Essentially, I want to show that although Rawls doesn't discuss issues of race and gender, his theory of justice can be used to address these pressing issues. Now, John Rawls continues to be a central figure in contemporary political philosophy, and he's published, the book that I'm working with was published in the 70s. It's called A Theory of Justice, and he writes within the liberal tradition. So that's just some background on Rawls. Now, before jumping into my overview of his theory, I'd like to emphasize that it is an ideal theory, which means that he makes a number of idealizing assumptions. For instance, he assumes that the society he is talking about is a society where there is no crime, a society where resources are plentiful, and he doesn't discuss particular issues of race and gender. However, that doesn't mean that his theory doesn't help us when thinking about these issues. And finally, his theory is meant to apply to an ideal society, so not directly to our society and our problems. For guidance on how to apply it to our society and our problems, he thinks that we are to turn to non-ideal theory, which deals precisely with these matters and helps translate ideal theories into non-ideal practical theories and principles. So Rawls expects his principles to guide the application of his theory and to provide us with practical ways of dealing with these issues. But we need to start first, for him, with this ideal kind of thinking. But there is instead another point of view from which we could start. We could start from the bottom, from our society, from our real experiences, from our very personal experiences, and from the injustices that we live every day. And this is the opposition's potential point of view. And I want to argue that, and I want to show that Rawls can actually be useful for thinking through these specific cases in our society, even though he doesn't start there, even though he starts from ideal theory. Now, I'd like to give you an overview of his theory, and starting with his two principles of justice. The first is a principle of greatest equal liberty, which insists that all our basic liberties are to be protected, and these include things like freedom of speech, freedom of thought and religion, etc. The second principle is a principle of fair equality of opportunity, which insists that positions need to be open to everyone. Everyone in society should be able to have access to positions if they're qualified. The second part of the second principle is the difference principle, which insists that we should, if there are going to be social and economic inequalities in a society, they need to be arranged so that they are to the advantage of the least advantaged in that society. So these principles are in order of priority. The first comes before the two parts in the second, and the part A comes before part B. In cases where we're trying to figure out which one we should address first, we should address the first one, and so on. Now, Rawls argues that these are the principles that free and equal people would hypothetically choose if they put themselves in an impartial position and really thought about what is just. Now, I'm not going to present his arguments for that. I'm just going to take it for granted that these are really good principles that we would want to put in place in our society. Now, for Rawls, justice is an institutional matter, which means that his principles are meant to apply to institutions, particularly what he calls the basic structure. The basic structure are those foundational institutions that we cannot do without, those institutions like the political system and the educational system and the labor market, those institutions that we can't opt out of and that are foundational for a society. Now, I'd like to emphasize a key concept, and that's the concept of self-respect. For Rawls, he means something like self-worth, self-esteem, the knowledge that our values are worth pursuing, And for him, the concept of self-respect is foundational. It's important that individuals have it, because without it, we wouldn't have the motivation to be active and productive members of society, and we wouldn't have a stable society without that. So I think that that's a very interesting concept, and it's going to come up later, so I wanted to introduce it then. Now, I want to talk about Rawls and social inequality. And I have socialized in parentheses because I like to talk about socialized inequality, but I'll get to that in the complications section. First, I just want to introduce how he understands social inequality. So for Rawls, social inequality is the unequal distribution of social primary goods, which include things like rights and liberties, and even self-respect, like we were talking about earlier. Now, to clarify social inequality, let's contrast it with natural inequality, and which results from the unequal distribution of natural primary goods, which are things like health and imagination and creativity. And as you can see, the distinction seems to be something like natural inequality has to do with what you're born with, the qualities that you can't necessarily change, and social inequality has more to do with social contingencies, like what race or gender is favored by society with regards to the distribution of rights and income, for instance. Now, to get into some of the complications, I would like to say that this distinction is a useful one, just that we need to be careful what we group under social and what we group under natural, because for Rawls, his principles are meant to apply more so to social inequalities and more indirectly to natural inequalities. So that's going to determine how much of an emphasis we put on addressing social inequality issues, whatever we group under that, versus natural inequality. So, for instance, the feminist scholarship has shown us that the underrepresentation of girls in sports and STEM fields is not necessarily due to any lack of ability on their part, but maybe due to the fact that girls are socialized into choosing some activities over others, developing some skills over others, and this leads to a lack of motivation to develop certain skills, and then leads to social inequality in what they choose to pursue as their job. So this is an example of something that may appear as natural inequality, like maybe we're just born to be more caring and find those kinds of jobs. However, it's actually it comes about through a socialization process. Girls are socialized from birth to being a certain way. So that's why I like to talk about socialized inequality instead. Now, I'd like to look at two specific examples from sociology on gender and racial inequality in the workplace. And I've quoted above the conclusions to two articles. The first is on gender inequality, and I'll just summarize it for you. Basically, the study found that women, when you use open recruitment methods, the share of jobs that women possess, the share of management jobs increased. And when you used informal networks, men's share of these same management jobs tended to increase. So this tends to happen in white male-dominated fields where recruitment takes place through informal networks that exclude minorities. Now, the second study found that the networks of white men connected them with better job training and job opportunities than did the networks of black men. So in both of these cases, we can see that informal job recruitment through networks often leads to the reproduction of existing gender and racial inequalities in the workplace. Now, what's interesting to think about from a Rawlsian perspective is what would he have to say in this case? From a business point of view, we can see that recruiting from within the company is much cheaper than open recruitment methods, because you don't have to spend money on advertising outside the company, and you don't have to sift through as many job applicants, which can be time consuming and can consume resources as well. So from a business point of view, we should keep informal networks, even though it would be detrimental to the number of individuals in minority groups that are part of the even though it would exclude minority groups from the job opportunities. But what would Rawls have to say about this? And can Rawls say anything about this? As I mentioned in the beginning, there are some people who might say that you need to start from these specific cases and then dictate what we should say. But Rawls starts from ideal theory, and then he moves on to these specific cases. Well, he doesn't, but that's what I'm trying to do. So let's see how that works out. So here I present my Rawlsian extension to address socialized inequality, and I argue that Rawls would endorse open recruitment methods and other affirmative action type policies for 3 reasons. First, because this is one way in which you would ensure fair equality of opportunity for everyone, that positions are open to everyone, and it would also promote the self-respect of individuals, because essentially society would be saying, look, even if it costs businesses more, we care enough about you and your contribution to the society that we're not going to exclude you. And finally, it would increase equality because it would allow minorities to have better access to greater job opportunities and training. Now, the final idea I wanted to present to you is just extending Rawls to apply to those cases that may seem like natural inequality, like the case of the girls in STEM and sports. I'd like to extend him to those cases that he may not think about when he's writing, but which he certainly, I think, if we presented the case to him, would agree that we would need to address these inequalities. Thank you.